Welcome to 2020, and welcome back to the South Texan News Desk. I'm your host, Tom Miller. Now, before we begin, I'd like to make a quick note about the content of the podcast. Obviously, whenever we take a break, especially one as long as the Christmas break, we see a lot of stories develop in that time. But since the podcast is not active, we don't really report on them. So I'm going to be focusing more on current news as opposed to just recapping the stuff that happened over that Christmas break as well, like the killing of Soleimani, for example. Very important and very significant, but so much has been reported on that by now that I think it's safe to assume that everybody is aware of that, and going back over it would be like beating a dead horse. So today, we begin with some news about Kobe Bryant. The 41-year-old basketball legend was reported having died in a helicopter crash on the date of this recording, Sunday, January 26th. Now, because that story is very new, we don't have a lot of information on that, so I'll probably be revisiting this story a little bit in next week's podcast when we have a better idea of the whole story behind this. But we do know that Kobe Bryant is the veritable face of the Los Angeles Lakers, even after having retired. He stayed loyal to that team throughout his entire basketball career. So this comes not only as a shocking loss to the Los Angeles Lakers, but to the entire basketball world as a whole. Next, we looked at the case of 2019 nCoV, which is the official name for the recent outbreak of a coronavirus that has been sweeping across China and now the U.S. There have been suspected coronavirus cases reported right here in Texas, notably at Texas A&M College Station, as well as Baylor University. Now, A&M requested some results on the blood of that infected student, and they're expecting to receive those results Monday the 27th. So we will probably be hearing a little bit more about that as per those results very soon. Back in California, Orange County has also reported some cases of potential coronavirus popping up. So with all this happening, it's important to look exactly at what coronaviruses are and where 2019 nCoV actually falls on the spectrum of coronaviruses. Now, China has had a history of being the origin of coronaviruses, the most infamous of these being SARS, or Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. That major SARS outbreak occurred in 2002 and went into 2003, much like how 2019 nCoV began in late 2019 and has rolled over into 2020. So with 2019 nCoV also originating in China, it sort of raises the question as to why exactly China seems to be a breeding ground for these coronaviruses. The dense population, meaning that the contact transmission inherent to most coronaviruses has a very high chance of happening and happens at very high rates, and the polluted state of China are some of the biggest possible factors for this. Now, aside from SARS, the other of the more lethal coronaviruses that we know of is MERS, or Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. And the last major MERS outbreak was in 2012 in Saudi Arabia, although it got sort of a second wind in 2015 when a smaller outbreak popped up in South Korea. Now, compared to SARS and MERS, which claimed about 750 and 630 lives in their outbreaks respectively, 2019 nCoV doesn't appear to be quite as serious. That said, 2019 nCoV has claimed about 20 lives so far, and there's a good chance that death toll will unfortunately rise before the virus dies out. Meanwhile, Wuhan, the Chinese city acting as ground zero for 2019 nCoV, has taken the sunset overdrive approach and quarantined the entire city, shutting down just about every form of public transportation. Meanwhile, the Chinese government has strongly advised anyone outside of Wuhan not to enter the area, and advising those already in Wuhan to stay in the city until further notice. Now, not only does this pose a significant threat to the Chinese people and to international trade as well, since we have already seen from the cases in the U.S. that, for example, personnel on shipping freighters coming from China and going to other places do have a risk of carrying that coronavirus around, but it also coincides with the Chinese Lunar New Year, which is a very important cultural holiday in China, although many of the traditional celebrations have been called off as per the government's request and advice to avoid public gatherings as much as possible. So in the face of all this, what can you do to protect yourself from 2019 nCoV? Well, let's be honest. Vaccines do not cause autism. So if you haven't already, get your vaccinations and that'll largely cover you. In fact, the flu is still the deadliest virus for this time of year. So in taking the same precautions you'd take for flu, chances of you contracting coronavirus, let alone dying from it, are slim to none. That said, if you do feel an upper respiratory infection coming on, get to the hospital and get checked as soon as you can. Because even if it's not 2019 nCoV, it's still worth getting that upper respiratory infection taken care of as quick as you can. When it comes to the medical field, you can't be too safe. Now, backtracking a little bit on what I said at the beginning of the podcast, I do want to take a look at the current state of the impeachment trial against President Trump and where that stands in late January. Since the story developed, the House has voted to impeach the president. However, that's only one part of the battle. The Senate is the chamber that actually needs to conduct that vote, and if they get a majority on that, that will cause the true impeachment of Trump. But looking at the current demographics of those two chambers, it's not too likely that that vote will go anywhere once it reaches the Senate. See, in 2016, when Trump was first elected, the Republicans swept the Congress and the presidency. But in 2018, control of the House shifted over to the Democrats, where it currently sits. They have a Democratic majority in the House. However, the Senate has still retained a Republican majority. Now, we all know that all these kinds of things happening in Washington are split along party lines. So it really doesn't come as a surprise that the Democratic Party having a majority in the House would generally lead to the impeachment vote in the House against Trump. That said, with the Republican majority in the Senate, it's pretty unlikely that they will allow their party president to be unseated. But there has been, across Trump's time in office, some Republicans going against him. So really it remains to be seen what exactly will come of the Senate vote. So it's important to stay tuned into that, because obviously it is something that's affecting the very upper levels of the American government, which naturally trickles down to affecting the entirety of America. But until next week, that's all we have for you. So for more information about the goings-on here at TAMUK, check out the South Texan written right here at TAMUK, or check us out online on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at the South Texan.